Hi, I'm Phil Hobble and this is my 79th video discussing British science fiction. Something a little different this time. A report on my recent visit to Hay-on-Wye village, the famous bookshop village. I fitted in this visit as part of a short holiday I'm enjoying in Monington, a little village near Hereford. My first port of call was the Hay Castle Bookshop. Which alas had no science fiction section. Next, I tried nearby Adyman's Annex. Here there was a greater display of old and new books of every description, everything that is except science fiction. Also nearby was the once famous open-air Honesty bookshelves. Lots of books all jumbled together in no particular order, fiction and non-fiction. On a quick scan I failed to detect any science fiction, nor indeed anything else of value or interest. A big disappointment, but hardly a surprise. I was off to a bad start. My next tries were at North Books and the Hay-on-Wye bookshop. Whilst they had good stocks of hardcover fiction, none of it was science fiction. Unfortunately, as you can see, the Hay-on-Wye bookshop has a really excellent selection of fiction, old and new, but it's not science fiction. Here's a typical nice vintage detective fiction, very collectible, George Goodchild, McLean stories, nice condition, priced at £30, which McLean collectors would probably pay, but it's not science fiction. However, I had much better luck with Greening Booksellers on High Town, one of the newer bookshops. Here I was able to pick up a splendid hardcover of new writings in SF number 22, with stories by my friends and clients Sid Bounds and Ted Tubb. In this bookshop we have a really nice selection of older and new fiction, and here's some vintage science fiction. We saw that on one of my early videos, the 1950s Grayson and Grayson anthology, which I already have. But here's one I want for my own collection because it contains stories by my clients E.C. Tubb and Cindy Bounds. I've only got the paperback edition, so I'm pleased to get the hardcover. And £10 is a reasonable price for collectors. And my good luck continued at Murder and Mayhem on Lion Street. This little shop cannot be too highly recommended. Its stock of vintage detective and mystery fiction is exceptional. Now this shop, well, it's predominantly mystery and detective fiction, has smatterings of science fiction hidden away on the shelves. It's well worth the search. And as an example of that, there's a lovely book here, which I found on the selected horror, which is a vintage Stanley G. Weinbaum American book, The Dark Other. Just get the title page there. Very rare book. Just a job for my own personal collection. Just across the road on Lion Street is its sister shop, Adyman Books. Adyman has a great fiction display, especially its science fiction room. But in the event, as an old collector, I already had nearly all of the vintage SF material that they had. But I still managed to find a couple of nice issues of New Worlds with client stories I was missing. Now, as you can see, this bookshop is the real deal. This is the mecca for all science fiction collectors. Adyman's Books. As you can see, this corner is particularly rich in vintage science fiction. Highly recommended. There's American pulps, British magazines, all sorts of stuff. For instance, there's a vintage British Planet Stories, which features a novelette by E.C. Tubb, is by Eric Storm. Very collectible item, Kelly Free's cover. Here we see 1930s thrilling wonder, which has been featured on my video before. This one's of particular interest because it contains a story by John Russell Fearn, which I've talked about. Page 80, Lords of 2016. That was the story which I adopted for as one of my Nick Hazard comics. People will remember from earlier videos. And there's another classic Fearn story in this thrilling window, World Without Chance. There we see it, page 98. It's Marcioni illustration. Walking across one of his most influential stories. He adapted it several times for novels, etc. And they've even got a copy of this vintage title with the Ron Turner cover, which I've talked about in my videos. And this was a book series which I myself published many years ago. And here's a couple of vintage New Worlds with stories by my client Sidney J. Bounds, which I haven't got a copy of that, and Philip E. High, a story of his, Dictator Bait, which I'm also missing, so I'm happy to snap these two up for my collection. My next visit was to Richard Booth's, who I believe was one of the founding fathers of the Here Book Town. Booth's shop is packed with all kinds of books, old and new, and does have a specialised science fiction section in his basement. Alas, nowadays it's a shadow of its former riches. Shelves of alphabetical by-order books were empty or greatly depleted, and I didn't find anything of interest. It would appear that Booths have difficulty in replenishing SF stocks. Evidently, people are choosing to sell collector's items through eBay rather than to a specialist bookseller these days. Or maybe I just caught Booth at a bad time. But he's certainly worth a visit. My final visit was to the Here Cinema Bookshop on Castle Street, one of the longest established shops, and I'm happy to report it's still one of the best. It offers second-hand and antiquarian books in all subjects and has a science fiction section that's well stocked with vintage material, both British and American. There was not a really vast amount of material, but what there was offered included a great variety of important pulp and digest magazines, all of it of strong collector interest. Here I was pleased to pick up Barry Malzberg's important non-fiction study, The Engines of the Night, and an upgrade on my 1950s paperback copy of The City in the Sea, and a 1951 British hardcover I was missing, The Rockets by Harry Edmonds, an uncommon title which more or less completes my collection of all British SF hardcovers in the post-war decade. In this particular shelf we have an excellent selection of really vintage science fiction magazines. Super Science, Thrilling Wonder, Science Stories, Satellite, Space Travel, never heard of that one. Or Sky World, that's in the 1970s one, I think. Future, yeah, the British editions, that I think. Unknown Worlds. Yeah, the British editions, Mountains. And what have we got here? Other Worlds. Universe. Oh, and there's even a German pulp. This is a really excellent. And there's a 100th edition of New Worlds, very collectible edition with all the leading British authors. And here we see a nice little select reference section, science fiction reference works. Interesting books. There's the classic standard 2 works, Encyclopedia of Science Fiction and Aldous' Billion Year Spree. I had a little involvement with this book. Brian asked me to proofread his manuscript before it went to publication. And I had the privilege of being one of the first people to actually read this book. A classic. And here we see quite a rare book. City in the Sea, Wilson Tucker, one of the Nova novels of the mid-50s. I did a special video about these, and this is a particularly nice copy, and it's a very attractive price. In fact, I think it's an upgrade on my copy, so I'll snaffle this. And here we see a few of our friend E.C. Tubbs' humorous novels. Always nice to see them. Here we see all the 7 items I picked up at Here on Wye. The other, which we see at the bottom there, was an unsold early Weinbaum novel that was published posthumously in 1950. Reputedly, it's not classed as one of his best, but it is quite rare and was one I lacked in my collection, and I'm sure it will be of interest. Weinbaum died young from cancer in 1935, but his short career was highly lauded. He was very influential on many of his contemporaries in the pulps, including John Russell Fearn. I have all of his stories in the magazines, which included Wonder Stories, Amazing Stories, Astounding Stories, Startling Stories, and Thrilling Wonder Stories. Summing up, in all the 4 shops I've highlighted here, Green Link, Murder and Mayhem, Adyman's and the Here Cinema Bookshop, they're all still flying the flag of vintage SF very nicely. It just remains for me to profoundly thank my daughter Claire for arranging everything as a birthday surprise and driving me here, and to my grandson Arthur, who accompanied us on the holiday and filmed and posted this video for me.